if you see what's happening now in Russia, they're in a stage of panic. I mean, because now they know that they're going to lose this war. They were they were winning this war slowly, but they were winning this war for 2.5 years, well, slightly less. But now they know that they are going to lose. That's why they started, to threaten the world with nuclear strikes, and it's happening, from all levels of the Russian governments. You have dozens of publications of the Russian officials claiming that, well, now we will have to use nuclear weapons. Now we will destroy you because you cross the red line. Yes, we crossed the red line because for the first time in two and a half almost years of war, right? We changed the strategy, and now it's a strategy to win the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the historian Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, the author of Blowing Up Ukraine, The Return of Russian Terror, and From Red Terror to Terrorist State, Russia's Security Services in the Fight for World Domination. Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, really appreciate your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Thank you.
To begin with, I wanted to get your take on the big story from the past week, which is the Americans agreeing that Ukraine can use US-supplied weapons to strike targets inside Russian territory, albeit with some restrictions. But it's interesting, in the past day or so, we've heard that Ukraine has used HIMARS rockets to strike a Russian air defense battery inside Belgorod Oblast. How significant do you think this change in position from the White House is?
Very significant. Let's add also that not only the United States gave Ukraine permission to strike against Russian territory, but also France, Germany, and basically all other countries. Here's the problem. This war was started in February of 22. And from February of 22, everybody had an understanding that Ukrainians are not allowed to use Western weapons against the strikes, for strikes against the Russian territories. They were allowed to use it against the occupied territories of Ukraine, including Crimea, for example, which was annexed in 2014. But they were not allowed to strike against the Russian Federation. What put Ukraine in a terrible position, because you cannot win a war. You're not able to win a war if you are not allowed to strike against the territory of your enemy. While Russia, of course, was actually striking Ukraine from inside the Russian Federation. We have to understand that, for example, the city of Kharkov, which is the second largest city in Ukraine after Kiev, is so close to the Russian border that Russians are bombarding it from the Russian airspace. So the Russian planes, they even do not cross the Ukrainian border in order to strike against the city. So that's why at the end, the West realized that they need to change tactics, because the idea that Russia would be tired of war, will be afraid that they would lose more people than they thought they would lose, didn't lead anywhere. And the conception that Ukraine is not allowed to win this war because Russia could not lose this war does not lead to the end of the war. And we have to understand that everybody has this idea to end this war, right? I mean, no one wants this war to continue. Ukraine doesn't want it, the West doesn't want it, Europe and the United States. But by now, it's clear, unfortunately, that Putin is not planning to stop. And the only way to stop this war is to win this war. That's why the strategy had to be changed.
Why has it taken so long, though? Because it's taken more than 2 years for the US and other Western allies of Ukraine to agree to let Ukraine use weapons supplied by them inside Russia. Some would say the Ukrainians have been fighting with one hand tied behind their back in that time because of that restriction. Why has it taken so long?
Well, it took the United States more than 2 years to enter the Second World War. and England was fighting alone against enemy, actually both the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, which was helping Germany until June of 41 when Germans invaded Russia. So unfortunately, Americans are slow. We have to add that Europeans were not in a hurry to allow to use their weapons as well. Again, everybody was hoping that Putin at one point will stop and would agree to negotiate the problems, etc., etc. Unfortunately, this is not happening. We see that Russia now is in a stage of permanent war, meaning that they are able and ready psychologically and financially and militarily and economically to continue this war as long as it's needed, meaning that they're taking Ukraine, meter by meter with a slow speed, but nevertheless they're taking territories. And we also have to understand that they're not actually taking territories. They ruin territories first. What they're getting at the end, every village they take, every small city they take, they ruin it completely. At the moment when the Russian troops are entering the territory, there is not a single building holding, and there is not a single person staying. In the beginning of the war, some Ukrainians actually were not in a hurry to leave their houses because everybody was hoping that, this war will end. Oh, this is so irrational. This is so ridiculous that this war will end somehow very soon. You should not leave your house. But now it's clear that this is a war which leads nowhere. Unless Russia is defeated. The only way to defeat Russia is to strike against the Russian territory, because when you talk to Russians, especially those who live in cities like Moscow, they do not feel this war at all. They even do not know that this war exists. The Russian government, and this is an irony, and people were smiling in the beginning, prohibits these events to call a war. And when you talk to Muscovites, they go to theaters, they go to cinemas, they go to cafes. Life is normal. There is no shortage of anything in Moscow. And actually, for them, there is no war at all. There's some development, some military activity, which goes somewhere far, far away, in this strange country, Ukraine, which decided to fight for its independence. But Russia doesn't feel the war. And until Russia feels this war, they would not be ready to stop it.
Well, that begs the question whether the West needs to move even further on this issue, whether they are going far enough, because even though America has now said Ukraine can use US supplied weapons inside Russia, that's only in a very limited area against very specific targets. Should it be broader?
Well, my opinion is, unfortunately, I have to add that we are going to have Third World War. You could argue that it's already started. We could argue that it started on 24th of February 22. There are some people who think that we are still, in a 1937 period, that the war is not started yet, but unfortunately Russia is preparing for it, and the last changes within the government also indicate that Russia is, considering the possibility that this war will become, real, and that it would escalate, and the theater of military activity will be widened, and it would go outside the Ukrainian territory. They just conducted some tactical nuclear weapons exercises with Belarus. They moved some time ago. They moved nuclear weapons to Belarus. What I think is a great danger. On a rhetorical question, you could not actually imagine how how crazy Russians are. They are threatening the world with preventive nuclear strikes against Eastern Europe, against Central Europe. A couple of days ago, the deputy of foreign minister actually said that Americans will pay for the decision to allow Ukrainians to use their weapons. I mean, they are ready to fight against this in the whole world. And unfortunately, they are supported by China. We have to add this. This is important help, which came to Russia, and they're dumping dollars now together with China and India. They're buying gold. The indication is that they're preparing for the full-scale war, and I think that's. I hope this would never happen. But in order to prevent this, and this is the only option, we we have to help Ukraine to win this war while this war is only a Russian-Ukrainian war. Because from the point of view of the West, this is still a Russian-Ukrainian war. From the point of view of Russia, they are fighting against NATO in Ukraine. So the only way to avoid the full-scale Third World War is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. But for this, we need to have to abolish all limitations which we had for this like two more years, specifically giving Ukraine the long-range weaponry, which is able to reach Moscow. Because again, Russia is a city of Russia is a country of one city. It's difficult to imagine for Europeans, where you usually have many cities in each country, but this is not so for Russia. Whatever happens in Moscow is important. We remember what happened in Moscow when Prigozhin stated in June of last year that he is going to take Moscow. There was a huge panic, and Moscow kind of, capitulated even before Prigozhin reached it. But Moscow is important, so we have to give Ukrainians permission to strike against Moscow. We have to give Ukrainians weapons to strike against Moscow. And once again, this is the only chance to stop the war. Otherwise, this would escalate.
How credibly should we take the threat of Putin, for example, using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine or in other parts of Eastern Europe? That has been one of the reasons the Americans and others have been reluctant until now to provide certain weapons to Ukraine. Should we take those warnings from the Kremlin at face value, or is it a bluff?
Well, partially this is a bluff, but the bluff is that Russia would use nuclear weapons. Russia will not use nuclear weapons, but here's a trick. Russia moved nuclear weapons to Belarus. So I think what Putin would do, and that's how he usually behaved himself. He would strike from Belarus, not from Russia. So the retaliation will be against Belarus and not against the Russian Federation. And I think this is the plan. I do not think this is necessarily going to happen this way. Probably not. I do not think, for example, that they will strike against Ukraine. I do not think so, because they sincerely believe that they will take Ukraine without nuclear weapons or without nuclear options if they would stop foreign help to Ukraine. That's why it's very important for them to stop this help, because they sincerely believe that they are losing the war, not because the Ukrainians are fighting, but because the West is helping. So this is the idea, and the idea of to use nuclear weapons is also connected to the idea to stop the assistance to Ukraine. So let's strike against Poland or Lithuania, so the West would see that we are, ready to use nuclear weapons, and this would frighten them, and they would stop the war, help to Ukraine. This is the idea, but I think it's not going to be done by Russia formally, I think they would do it from Belarus, and that's why I think it's very important, not only to think about defending Ukraine, but also about thinking about changing regime in Belarus, because Lukashenko is extremely unpopular there. We know this. He lost elections. The Belarusians are against him, and the change of regime in Belarus is also a necessity, because Russia is using this territory for advance against Europe. That's how the war against Ukraine started in February of 22. They were trying to reach Kiev, advancing from Belarus, and they also would use Belarus, of course, if they plan any ground operation against Eastern Europe, first of all, Poland and the Baltic states. So Belarus is very important strategic territory, and I think at one point, I do not know when, but at one point the West would have to deal with this problem as well.
Do you think Vladimir Putin actively wants to provoke a full-scale war with NATO? And whether you then want to call that World War III, whether other countries get drawn in, do you think Putin wants to provoke that? Because a lot of people would say if he did engage in a full-scale war with NATO, he would inevitably lose.
He will lose, but that's not how he'll look at it. He thinks that if the West is not surrendering, it's because they do not believe that we are ready to destroy it. This is the problem of Putin, and of course he would like to get everything without a war. When he started this war in February of 22, the idea was, and this was general understanding, by the way, everywhere in Europe and in the United States, that Ukraine would be taken in a week or in a month. No one was expecting Ukraine to fight. And it's only because Ukrainians have started to fight for their freedom, the West started to help them, because the historical lessons of the Second World War are well known, right? And Poles knows it very well. No one helped Poland in September of 39, and it was taken quickly, but it did not stop the war, right? It just provoked Hitler to advance further and further and further. So when Ukrainians started to fight, then countries like Poland and the Baltic states, who were under, the Baltic states were under Soviet rule, and Poland, of course, had terrible history lessons with Russian occupation. They pressed the NATO countries to start to assist Ukraine very quickly, arguing that otherwise this war would escalate into European war. And they were right. So for 2.5 years, we are holding this barrier. But unfortunately, again, this just provokes Russia to conduct more and more, military operations and attack, and they're not planning to stop. Now, Putin, unfortunately, he's lieutenant colonel of the FSB. I mean, he's not even in general, right? His education stopped at one point. He's an experienced politician, a leader now, that's true. But all he remembers that in 1945, Americans used nuclear weapons, won the war against Japan, and became a superpower. All he remembers that in 1962, Khrushchev, agreed to take nuclear weapons from Cuba back to the Soviet Union, and lost the chance to win the war against the United States. So I'm afraid that for him, this myth or this legend about the importance of nuclear weapons, which prevented 2 times Russia to become a dominant power, is very important. I'm afraid he might believe that in order to win the war, in order to establish itself as a great power, you would have at one point to use nuclear weapons. And yes, this is the real danger. This is the danger as long as Putin is in power. And that's why it's important to take him down, to change the regime. But once again, the way to do it, the safest way to do it, let's put it this way, is to allow Ukraine to win. Otherwise, yes, we would have, use NATO ground forces, as Macron was suggesting, and otherwise the war will escalate.
What would you say, Yuri, is the biggest single threat to Vladimir Putin at the moment?
Ukraine, the only one. The only one. There is no domestic opposition. We have to face the reality. There are no opponents. All opponents are killed on preventive level, and it's not by chance that he killed people like Boris Nemtsov or Alexei Navalny. They killing leaders on preventive level, and there is no domestic opposition. We do not see it. I mean, we see some people, some brave people who go to prison for their political views, but the amount of those people is not critical for Putin regime. Everything is controlled quite well by the FSB. The only people who have, weapons in their hands in Russia is the FSB and the Minister of Defense, the army, and those people are loyal. There is no way to take down Putin peacefully. There are no people within the Russian government who are opposing him. So the only way to take him through the victory of war in Ukraine.
Could his position be undermined very quickly, though? I mean, if, for instance, Ukraine was allowed to strike targets in, for example, Moscow, deeper into mainland Russia, could you then see internal opposition to Putin rear its head? I mean, the nature with all these dictators is that, if they're going to rule by terror, they've got to rule by absolute terror. The moment their authority starts to appear shaky, it can go downhill very quickly.
I think the answer is yes, although I do not want to say that it's very simple and it's not going to be very quick. But again, we know from history that, the attempt to kill Hitler, was the result of Germany not being able to conduct the war the way German army was expecting, right, in 1944, sorry. So there are some people who are able to deal with Putin, meaning the FSB, for example. But in order to do this, they have to have a good reason to do this. And if they would have a good reason to do this, they would do it in order to survive. But we even need to help them, right? Because so far, everything was normal for them. Again, Russia didn't feel this war at all. After these recent statements, and again, the statements came from approximately the same time from the United States, from France, from Germany. Actually, if you see what's happening now in Russia, they're in a stage of panic. I mean, because now they know that they're going to lose this war. They were they were winning this war slowly, but they were winning this war for 2.5 years, well, slightly less. But now they know that they are going to lose. That's why they started, to threaten the world with nuclear strikes, and it's happening, from all levels of the Russian governments. You have dozens of publications of the Russian officials claiming that, well, now we will have to use nuclear weapons. Now we will destroy you because you crossed the red line. Yes, we crossed the red line because for the first time in two and a half almost years of war, right? We changed the strategy, and now it's a strategy to win the war. Except, prior to this, it was a strategy that Russia is not losing and Ukraine is not winning.
That is fascinating. So just to finish off by almost going back to where we started, you really do think, Yuri, that what we saw last week, that change in position, in particular from the Americans over US weapons being used by Ukraine against Russia inside Russia, you think that could be a game-changing moment in this war?
100%, 100%. Except that we have to continue to help Ukraine, because we do remember that for 5 months the American help, for example, to Ukraine was frozen, and this was a major deal for Ukraine. That's why we have all these problems around Kharkov now. We have to continue to help Ukraine with weapons, with long range weapons. We have to take down all limitations, including the limitation, if it still exists, I do not know, to strike against Moscow.
Dr. Yuri Felshtinsky, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.